Imagine being trapped in a building with armed terrorists, hearing gunshots echo through the hallways, knowing that any moment could be your last. Most people would panic, scream, or freeze in terror. But what if someone did the exact opposite? What if, in the face of death itself, one person's unexpected response not only saved lives, but left even the terrorists questioning everything they believed about fear, courage, and humanity? This is not a story about a superhero or a trained soldier. This is about Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old school counselor from Denver, whose reaction to the most terrifying experience imaginable shocked everyone who witnessed it, including the very people who came to kill her. Her response was so unusual, so completely opposite to what anyone expected, that it stopped terrorists in their tracks, changed the course of a hostage situation, and ultimately revealed a truth about human nature that nobody saw coming. What she did in those critical moments didn't just save her own life, it transformed everyone in that room and taught the world something profound about the power of unexpected reactions in the darkest of times. Get ready to discover how one woman's calm in absolute chaos became the most powerful weapon against terror, and why her story is being studied by psychologists, law enforcement, and crisis negotiators around the world. Sarah Martinez adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at the clock on her office wall. It was 2:47 p.m. on what seemed like the most ordinary Tuesday of her life. The Denver Community Education Center hummed with its usual afternoon energy. Teenagers chatting in the hallways, teachers preparing for after-school programs, and the gentle buzz of learning that Sarah had grown to love over her 8 years as a counselor there. She was reviewing case files for her 3:30 appointment when her colleague Jenny knocked on the doorframe. "Hey Sarah, did you see that new student who enrolled yesterday? The one with the anxiety issues?" Jenny asked, stepping into the small office that Sarah had decorated with inspirational quotes and photos of her rescue dog Max. "Marcus Thompson, right?" Sarah replied, pulling out a yellow folder. "I'm meeting with him next week." His previous school said he's been struggling since his dad deployed overseas. This was exactly the kind of case that drew Sarah to counseling, helping young people navigate the storms in their lives and find their inner strength. Sarah had always been drawn to the idea of helping others find calm in their chaos. Growing up as the middle child of 5 in a household where her father battled PTSD from his time as a police officer, she learned early that sometimes the most powerful thing you could offer someone was simply your steady presence. Her mother Maria used to say, "Mija, you have this gift of making people feel safe even when everything around them is falling apart." That gift had served her well in her career. Students who were initially resistant to counseling often found themselves opening up to Sarah's gentle but direct approach. She had a way of cutting through teenage drama to get to the heart of what was really bothering a young person. Her supervisor, Dr. Williams, often joked that Sarah could probably talk a hurricane into becoming a gentle breeze. The education center where Sarah worked wasn't a traditional school. It was a specialized facility that served students from across the district who needed extra support. Those dealing with behavioral issues, family crises, learning disabilities, or mental health challenges. The building housed about 200 students ranging from middle school to high school age, along with 40 staff members including teachers, counselors, administrators, and support staff. Sarah loved the diversity of her workplace. In any given day, she might counsel a teen mum struggling to finish her education, help a student with autism navigate social situations, or work with someone dealing with substance abuse in their family. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads of human struggle and the search for hope. That Tuesday had started like any other. Sarah arrived at 7:30 a.m., grabbed her usual coffee from the break room, and spent the first hour returning emails and reviewing her schedule. Her morning sessions had gone well. She'd helped a 16-year-old named Ashley work through her anxiety about returning to her home school, and spent an hour with the Martinez family, no relation despite sharing a last name, discussing their son's progress. During lunch, Sarah had eaten her turkey sandwich while reading an article about trauma-informed counseling techniques. She was always looking for new ways to help her students, constantly educating herself about best practices in her field. Her colleagues often teased her about being a counseling nerd, but they also came to her regularly for advice on difficult cases. The afternoon had been quiet until Jenny's visit. After their conversation about Marcus, Jenny headed back to her classroom while Sarah returned to her paperwork. She was making notes about a student's progress when she heard what sounded like firecrackers popping somewhere in the building. At first, Sarah didn't think much of it. The education center was located near a busy street, and unusual sounds weren't uncommon. Sometimes construction noise from nearby buildings filtered in through the windows. She continued writing, focused on capturing her thoughts about the breakthrough one of her students had experienced that morning. But then she heard screaming. Sarah looked up from her paperwork, her pen frozen mid-sentence. The screaming was coming from inside the building, and it wasn't the usual teenage drama she was accustomed to hearing in the hallways. This was different. Raw, terrified, desperate screaming that made her blood run cold. She stood up from her desk and moved toward her office door, which she always kept open during the day to make students feel welcome to drop by. As she stepped into the hallway, she could see other staff members emerging from their rooms with confused and concerned expressions on their faces. "What's going on?" called out Mr. Peterson, the science teacher, from his classroom door down the hall. Before anyone could answer, they heard more of those popping sounds, and this time Sarah recognized them for what they really were. These weren't firecrackers. These were gunshots. The realization hit the staff members in the hallway at roughly the same time. Sarah saw the color drain from Jenny's face as she stood frozen outside her classroom. Mr. Peterson quickly ducked back into his room. The security guard, Tom Williams, was speaking urgently into his radio at the main desk. That's when they heard the voice, loud, angry, and terrifying. "Everyone, on the floor! Now, anyone who moves dies." Sarah felt her heart begin to race. But something strange happened in that moment. Instead of the panic she might have expected, she felt an odd sense of clarity wash over her. It was as if her mind had shifted into a different mode entirely, one where time seemed to slow down and her thoughts became incredibly focused. She looked around at her colleagues in the hallway and saw pure terror on their faces. Jenny was starting to hyperventilate. Mr. Peterson looked like he might collapse. The substitute teacher, Mrs. Chen, was gripping the wall for support. And in that moment, Sarah realized that someone needed to stay calm. Someone needed to be the steady presence that could help others navigate this nightmare. The hardest part was still ahead, turning the agreements made under crisis conditions into lasting systemic change. Sarah knew that bureaucratic momentum was powerful, and that the urgency everyone felt immediately after the incident would fade as memory dimmed and other priorities emerged. But she also knew that something fundamental had shifted that day in the education center. For the first time in her career, she had seen the system not just from the perspective of the people it served, but from the perspective of the people it had failed. And that perspective, painful as it was to confront, was essential for creating the kind of changes that could prevent future tragedies. As Sarah prepared to return to work at the education center, she found herself thinking not about what had been lost that day, but about what had been gained. Understanding, empathy, and most importantly, a commitment to ensuring that no young person would ever again feel so unheard that violence seemed like their only option for getting attention. The real test would be whether that commitment could survive the transition from crisis response to everyday practice. 6 months after the incident at the Denver Community Education Center, Sarah Martinez sat in a courtroom watching Jake Morrison address a judge about his actions and their consequences. The young man who spoke bore little resemblance to the angry, desperate person who had entered her workplace with weapons and a poorly formed plan to force people to listen to his pain. "Your Honor," Jake said, his voice steady and clear, "I take full responsibility for my actions that day. I terrorized innocent people, including children who had already experienced trauma in their lives. There is no excuse for what I did, and I understand that I must face the consequences." He paused, looking toward the gallery where Sarah sat alongside several of his former teachers, social workers, and surprisingly, some of the students and staff who had been in the building that day. "But I also want you to know that the conversation that followed, my terrible choices, has led to changes that are already helping other young people avoid the path that brought me here." Sarah had spent the past months working with Jake, Marcus, and a team of district officials to develop what they called the Early Warning and Rapid Response Protocol, a comprehensive system for identifying and supporting students who were showing signs of crisis before they reached the breaking point. The program was already showing results. 3 students had been identified as being at high risk for self-harm or violence, and all 3 were receiving intensive support services that addressed not just their immediate needs but the underlying systemic issues that had contributed to their situations. Marcus had been sentenced 3 months earlier to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of early release if he continued his work with the victim advocacy and crisis prevention programs he had helped develop while in custody. His case had been complicated by a prior record, but even the prosecutor had acknowledged that his transformation and commitment to helping others had been remarkable. Jake's case was different. He had no prior record, and his actions during and after the incident had demonstrated a genuine commitment to making amends and preventing future tragedies. The district attorney had worked with Sarah and others to develop an unusual plea arrangement that emphasized restorative justice and community service over purely punitive measures. Martinez, the judge said, turning to Sarah. You've been working with Mr. Morrison throughout this process. In your professional opinion, does he pose a continued risk to public safety? Sarah stood, aware that her words could determine the course of Jake's life. Your Honour, when I first encountered Jake Morrison, he was a young man who felt so powerless and unheard that he resorted to violence to get attention for legitimate grievances. Today, he is someone who has channeled that same passion for justice into constructive advocacy that is already preventing other young people from experiencing the desperation he felt. She looked at Jake, who was listening intently. I believe that Jake has learned something many people never learn, that being heard and valued as a human being is so powerful that once you experience it authentically, you become committed to ensuring others have that same experience.
The judge nodded thoughtfully.
And you believe his continued involvement in crisis prevention work is beneficial? I believe it's essential, Sarah replied. Jake and Marcus have insights into the warning signs and risk factors for youth violence that those of us who work in the system often miss. Their lived experience, combined with their commitment to change, makes them uniquely qualified to help identify and support other at-risk young people. The sentence that followed was unprecedented. Jake would serve 2 years in a residential treatment and community service facility, during which he would complete his education, receive intensive counseling, and work full-time on crisis prevention programs. Upon completion, he would continue his advocacy work while on supervised probation for an additional 3 years. It wasn't a light sentence, but it was one that prioritized rehabilitation and prevention over purely punitive measures. Most importantly, it was a sentence that recognized Jake's potential to contribute positively to society rather than simply viewing him as a threat to be contained. After the hearing, Sarah found herself walking out of the courthouse with Jake's former foster mother, Maria Santos, not the FBI agent, but a woman who had cared for Jake during his junior year of high school. Maria had been one of the few bright spots in Jake's childhood, and she had stayed in touch with him throughout the legal proceedings. I keep thinking, Maria said as they walked, if I had fought harder for him back then, if I had pushed the system more aggressively to get him the help he needed, maybe none of this would have happened. Sarah shook her head. You did what you could with the resources and support available to you at the time. The problem wasn't individual failure, it was systemic failure. That's what we're working to fix now. The changes that had emerged from the crisis were indeed significant. The district had hired 4 new crisis counselors, implemented the early warning system that Jake and Marcus had helped design, and created a new position, Director of Student Advocacy, specifically focused on ensuring that no student fell through the cracks the way Jake and Marcus had. Sarah had been offered that position but had declined, preferring to remain in direct service to students while consulting on the broader systemic changes. However, she had accepted a role training other counselors and educators in recognizing and responding to early warning signs of student distress. The education center itself had been transformed by the experience. The staff had undergone extensive training in trauma-informed practices and crisis de-escalation. More importantly, they had developed a culture of proactive outreach that emphasized building relationships with students before problems escalated to crisis levels. David, the student whose panic attack had been the catalyst for Sarah's initial interaction with the gunman, had become something of a peer counselor himself. His experience of being helped in the midst of terror had given him a unique perspective on the power of human connection during crisis situations. Martinez, he had told Sarah just the week before, I keep thinking about how you stayed calm that day even though you were scared. It made me realize that being afraid doesn't mean you can't help people. Sometimes being afraid and helping anyway is what courage really looks like. Ashley, the student who had spoken up during the crisis, had become a youth advocate, working with the district to ensure that student voices were included in policy decisions that affected their lives. Her experience of witnessing adults engage in genuine dialogue about problems that mattered to young people had inspired her to pursue a career in social work. The ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate participants. The incident had generated national attention not for its violence but for its resolution. Crisis negotiators, mental health professionals, and educators from around the country had studied the case, leading to changes in how similar situations were handled in other communities. Sarah had received invitations to speak at conferences, consult on crisis prevention programs, and even co-author a book about the incident. But she had been selective about these opportunities, accepting only those that directly contributed to improving support for at-risk youth. One of the most meaningful opportunities had been working with the FBI to develop new training protocols for crisis negotiators. Special Agent Maria Santos had become a colleague and friend, and together they had created simulation exercises that helped law enforcement officials understand how to recognize and respond to situations where the underlying issue was not criminal intent but rather desperate attempts to be heard and understood. The most surprising development had been the relationship that evolved between Sarah and the families of Jake and Marcus. Jake's biological mother, who had struggled with addiction during his childhood, had gotten clean and become an advocate for supporting families in crisis.
Marcus's parents, who had been devastated by their son's actions, had channeled their pain into working with other parents of troubled teens.
I used to think Marcus was just a bad kid who made bad choices, his mother Linda Thompson had told Sarah during one of their regular coffee meetings.
But now I understand that he was a hurt kid who didn't know how to express his pain in healthy ways. The tragedy isn't what he did. The tragedy is that he had to get to that point before anyone really listened to him. The legal and ethical questions raised by the case continued to generate discussion among professionals in various fields. Some critics argued that Sarah's approach had been reckless, that negotiating with people who had taken hostages set a dangerous precedent. Others contended that her willingness to stay and listen had prevented a tragedy that could have resulted in multiple deaths. Sarah herself struggled with some of these questions. Late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she sometimes wondered if she had made the right choices. Had she enabled Jake and Marcus by treating their grievances as legitimate? Had she put other people at risk by encouraging a prolonged negotiation instead of pushing for immediate surrender? These doubts were usually resolved by the evidence of positive change that continued to emerge from the incident. The early warning system had identified and helped dozens of students who might otherwise have continued to struggle in silence. The crisis prevention programs had been adopted by other districts. Most importantly, the culture of listening and proactive support that had emerged in her workplace was creating an environment where students felt valued and heard long before they reached crisis points. 1 year after the incident, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her office. Jake Morrison, now completing his community service work while enrolled in college courses, had been granted permission to visit the education center as part of a research project he was conducting on crisis prevention in educational settings. "I wanted to see the place again," he told Sarah as they sat in the same office where she had been working that Tuesday afternoon. "I wanted to remember what it felt like to be so desperate that this seemed like the only option." He looked around the office, taking in the inspirational quotes and photos that Sarah had redecorated with. "But mostly I wanted to thank you again for seeing something in Marcus and me that we couldn't see in ourselves. And bad." Sarah smiled, remembering the frightened and angry young man who had demanded her attention in the most dramatic way possible. "You both had important things to say. You just needed to find better ways to say them." "I've been working with 3 kids over the past few months," Jake said. "All of them were showing the same warning signs I showed when I was their age: anger, isolation, feeling like nobody cared what happened to them. But because of the system we helped create, they're getting support now instead of falling through the cracks." He pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photo of himself with 3 teenagers at a youth advocacy meeting. "That's Maria. She's 15 and was being bullied so severely she was planning to bring a weapon to school." "That's David. Different David from the one here. He's 16 and was bouncing between relatives after his parents died."
And that's Ashley, another Ashley. She's 14 and was cutting herself because she felt invisible at school.
Sarah studied the photo, seeing in it the faces of hope and possibility, rather than desperation and violence.
"They look happy. They are now," Jake said. "Because they know someone cares, someone is listening, and they have ways to get help that don't involve hurting themselves or other people." As Jake prepared to leave, he turned back to Sarah with a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Do you ever regret staying that day? Do you ever wish you had just left with everyone else?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about everything that had followed from that decision: the fear, the uncertainty, the criticism, the changes, the lives that had been touched and transformed.
No.
She said finally. "I don't regret staying. I regret that it took a crisis for us to really listen to what you were trying to tell us. But I don't regret being there when you needed someone to hear you." 2 years after the incident, the Denver Community Education Center hosted the first national conference on crisis as catalyst, transforming conflict into constructive change. Sarah served as the keynote speaker, addressing an audience of educators, law enforcement officials, mental health professionals, and policymakers from around the country. "We often think of crisis as something to be managed, controlled, or resolved as quickly as possible," she told the audience. "But sometimes crisis is actually a messenger, bringing us information we need to hear about problems we've been ignoring or minimizing." She looked out at the faces in the audience, many of whom had come because they were dealing with similar challenges in their own communities. The question isn't how to prevent all crises, It's how to respond to crisis in ways that address root causes rather than just symptoms, that build understanding rather than just impose control, and that recognize the humanity in everyone involved, rather than simply categorizing people as victims or perpetrators. After her speech, Sarah was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as a graduate student studying conflict resolution. Ms. I don't know why. Do you, Martinez, she said. I've read everything written about your case, and I'm still trying to understand how you knew that your approach would work. How did you know that treating the gunmen as human beings with legitimate grievances would lead to a peaceful resolution? Sarah smiled, remembering the many times she had been asked similar questions. I didn't know it would work, she admitted. I just knew that everything I had learned about human behavior suggested that people who feel truly heard and understood are less likely to resort to violence than people who feel ignored and dismissed. She paused, thinking about Jake and Marcus and all the students she had worked with over the years. But more than that, I knew that if I couldn't find a way to connect with them as human beings, then we would have missed an opportunity to understand and address the conditions that created the crisis in the first place. 3 years later, Sarah Martinez was still working as a counselor at the Denver Community Education Center, but her role had expanded far beyond her original job description. She served as a consultant to schools and law enforcement agencies around the world, helping them develop protocols for responding to crisis situations with empathy and understanding, rather than just force and control. Jake Morrison had completed his sentence and was working as a full-time youth advocate, speaking at schools and conferences about his experience and helping other young people find constructive ways to address their grievances with systems that seemed indifferent to their needs. He had also co-authored a book with Sarah about the incident and its aftermath, with all proceeds going to crisis prevention programs. Marcus Thompson had been released early from prison for good behavior and exceptional contributions to victim services programming. He was working toward a degree in social work while continuing his advocacy work for educational reform. The programs and protocols developed in response to the crisis had been adopted by school districts in 14 states, and the research conducted on the case had influenced policy changes at the federal level regarding how schools identify and support at-risk students. But for Sarah, the most meaningful measure of success was much simpler. In the 3 years since the incident, not a single student in their district had reached the point of desperation that had driven Jake and Marcus to their breaking point. The early warning system, the culture of proactive support, and the commitment to treating every student as a person worth saving had created an environment where young people felt heard, valued, and supported, long before their problems escalated to crisis levels. Standing in her office on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, almost exactly 4 years after the incident that had changed everything, Sarah looked at the photo on her desk, not of herself receiving an award or speaking at a conference, but of Jake, Marcus, and the dozens of young people whose lives had been touched by the changes that emerged from one woman's decision to stay calm in the chaos and respond to terror with compassion. Her response had indeed shocked everyone, not because it was dramatic or heroic, but because it was so fundamentally human. In choosing to see desperate young men rather than monsters, in choosing to listen rather than simply survive, in choosing to stay when everyone else left, Sarah Martinez had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful response to violence is simply the willingness to engage with the humanity of those who feel they have been pushed beyond the bounds of civilized discourse. The ripples from that choice were still spreading, touching lives and changing systems in ways that would continue for generations to come. And in a world that often seemed to respond to crisis with more crisis, Sarah's approach offered something different. A reminder that calm in the chaos isn't about the absence of fear, but about choosing connection over separation, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair, even in the darkest of circumstances.